Well, I'm delighted that we've got Ellen Galford with us tonight, who's both a poet and a prose writer. Ellen was born in Newark, New Jersey. She grew up in the suburban hills and looked longingly across the Jersey Meadowlands to New York City until she was old enough to move across the river. After a few transformative years in Manhattan, she emigrated to Scotland. She spent some time in London, about 8 years, working in the publishing industry, and then had to come back to Scotland. Ellen has published 4 novels. Her 4th novel, The Dyke and the Dybbuk, won a Lambda Award for Gay and Lesbian Literature from the American Publishing Association. Ellen has also contributed to short fiction and essays to anthologies on Jewish and LGBTQ themes on both sides of the Atlantic. So welcome, Ellen. It's great to have you with us.
You muted me. Okay, now I'm unmute. You hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good.
Good to have you. So we're going to talk about your writing and about your family and where you grew up. But why don't we start with a poem about a certain member of your family?
Okay. This is called New Jersey Nocturne. My grandmother's snores were oratorical. Vocables, fricatives, polysyllables, strings of sound that could be someone's name, warnings, inventories, declarations, full formed into sentences, drifting into ellipse, or slammed shut by an exclamation mark. Nightly, this thunder rolled across the room, leaping the canyon between our beds, making the wallpaper morning glories tremble on their trellises, before passing through the storm windows, skiting downhill over 30,000 backyards, crossing the turnpike and into the meadowlands, to whirl up mosquito clouds over the rusty waters, rattle the Pulaski Skyway's iron ribs, batter through Newark Bay and the Kilvan Hull, shatter dreams in Staten Island, trouble Brooklyn, then fade away to a rumble out at sea.
Wow. Ellen, how long did you share a bedroom with your grandmother?
Well, from the time I was quite wee, because after I got out of the cot, I was sharing with, in the room with my parents, till I was 10, at which point we moved to a house big enough that everybody got a bedroom to themselves.
Right. But I loved in that poem how we actually got the whole sound symphony of your grandmother there, and then a nice kind of imaginative journey. But you've also written a poem about your mother. Well, maybe you've written a few about your mother, but I'd like to know what she was like, and perhaps the next poem gives us a bit of an insight, but then maybe you can tell us a bit more about her.
Oh, well, my mother was an opera-loving school librarian who, among other things, she was a very American New York sort of Jewish mother in her way. Friends who met her here said, "Oh gosh, she's so sophisticated compared to our mothers." But to me, she was a very, she was a fantastic, terrifying, inspiring, wonderful, full of anxieties, full of imagination, and and somebody who looked after us as well as a hardworking working mother could, particularly in the 50s and 60s when this was a difficult thing to be. But then, of course, because my grandmother lived with us, we always had instant, she had backup. Anyway, this poem is called Jewish Calisthenics. Look, stay silent, carefully observe, and you will witness a domestic rite perfected over 50 generations, performed by one of its last great practitioners. She is the mistress of that ancient martial art known in our house as Jewish calisthenics. It is as crucial to our tribe as sword to samurai or flow of chi to Taoist master. Watch her assume the starting position. Right arm rises to shoulder height. Fist curves in upon itself. Forefinger slices through the air. Don't be deluded by the seeming simplicity. It carries more meanings, hidden and overt, than all your books of prophecy and revelation. Study these movements to crack the code. It's all in the angle, the direction, the rhythm, the velocity, in the anger, the intention, the passion, the ferocity. A forward pivot, for example, twice repeated, equals an admonition or sometimes a charm against Cossacks, reckless drivers, or the common cold. Meanwhile, a triple sideways shunt tells the recipient, don't you dare, ignore, forget this, or disobey. Whereas a solitary skyward jab may single either the punchline of a joke or a point scored in some domestic spat with God. A logic chopping, angels on pinhead counting, proto-Talmudic disputation that's run and run and run since Lilith first sued Adam for divorce. Those techniques are just the basics. She has more. An arsenal for waging cosmic war. The magic bullets to eradicate her fears, a baton to lead the music of the spheres.
So that finger, it must have meant so many different things to you. Shaking in anger, shaking in love, maybe, I don't know. Tell me a bit more about, growing up and your family. So you grew up in Newark, New Jersey.
Well, no, I was born in Newark, lived there for a few years. We then, after a brief spell in Washington, because my father did a couple of years working for the government. In fact, I remember seeing Eisenhower from my father's shoulders when Ike came back from Korea. That's but then we were basically, my father it was a mixed marriage in that he was a New York Jew. He was from the Bronx. My mother was from a Jewish Newark, from Philip Roth's Wequoic section. But it was the classic, early 50s white flight up into the suburbs. And they moved to a suburban town called Livingston, which I know is probably very, very different now than when I grew up there. But it was, it very much all a sort of offshoot in a way of the very close-knit Newark Jewish community. My parents were both teachers. My mother became a school librarian rather than an actual classroom teacher. My father was a history teacher, and they were both, he particularly was a great storyteller and joke teller. And it was very much an extended family because my grandmother, who always lived with us, I mean, she was there before I was born and she was there decades after I left until she was gone, which was actually after my mother was gone. But we were all part of this fantastic extended family. My grandmother was one of 10 siblings, all had, with one or two exceptions, all had children and generations. So we were part of this large tribe of the Lowenstein clan, because my grandmother's maiden name, was Lowenstein. So in fact, I think there are a couple of Lowensteins from various bits of America who might actually be here tonight. But it was a fantastic tribe that was full of noise and good food and talking and daily telephone calls in some cases. So it was very much, you knew who you were and you knew where you were from.
So the get-togethers must have been quite noisy. And
I think so, yes.
did you
because we were also, of course, there was that cultural thing, particularly, I don't know if it's just American Jews, maybe it's all Ashkenazim. We're all great interrupters.
Yeah. So your family, your parents were born in America, but did your grandparents come from?
Well, my grandmother was the first American child. She was the third child of the 10. And there were, I think, she was the first one born in America in 1888. They had arrived I think about 85, 86. When they actually arrived. That was on the matrilineal line. I mean, they were Litvak. They were the Litvak side. We had on both sides. I have Litvaks, I have Galicianos, but it was her family with they were very American in their accent and in their speech, but Yiddish was also spoken. There was a sense, you knew you were from this big tribe of people who mostly loved each other, clearly had fights, clearly had gossips, who were on the phone with each other all the time or seeing each other. So there was never a sense that you just belonged to a little tiny nuclear family. And having my grandmother live with us meant we were sort of action central for the phone calls and the Passover dishes that would arrive for a family Seder. And of course, we always wind up in our basement because we had the biggest basement to store them in. I still have people's Passover dishes from Seders in probably 1962 that have somehow wound up in my house.
And your father's side of the family, did
My
they?
father's side of the family, they were, where that was the New York side. I mean, I was also, my father was a fantastic character himself, a great raconteur, a great teller of stories. In fact, we on his tombstone, we put, "That reminds me of a story." Because that was his definitive. He had files of jokes and anecdotes. And because he was a teacher, he always was a great at entertaining a captive audience. But his family, I think, was much more complicated in some ways. It was smaller. It didn't quite have the passionate warmth of the matrilineal side. So it was very much, in terms of the tribe I feel I belong to, it's primarily was these Litvaks, these people who were from Kovna gubernia, or from a provincial town in Kurland, not far from, when it was the Duchy of Kurland. They were, he was I think my great grandfather was originally, as well as Yiddish, spoke German, was his school language. My great grandmother would have spoken Russian as well as Yiddish. And so Yiddish was presumably the lingua franca until they came to the States and then learned English. Although again, Yiddish was the background noise for all of us. I mean, it's the classic thing, as people who are Gallic speakers will understand, where it's in one generation you can speak it. The next generation, my parents' generation, phrases. By our generation, it's just random words.
Right. Well, we're going to talk more about Yiddish and your exploration of Yiddish in a little while. But talking about writing, when did you first start writing?
I think I started dictating. There is somewhere that I probably, again, still have in a file, because I have a lot of stuff that came back over the Atlantic in a container. I think my first poem got dictated, because it's in my parents' handwriting, from when I was about 3.
Wow.
So I probably did, and I did write odd bits of poetry on and off. And then essentially, when I didn't write perhaps seriously until I got, quite late on. I mean, I was sort of wrote kind of quietly in the background, wrote poetry that got read out in school and that sort of thing. But then I think once I sort of started working in publishing, I thought I was doing a lot of day job writing. I was editing, I was writing, and got kind of worded out. So didn't really, aside from things I did kind of very quietly to myself, didn't get into. I think that my first novel was published, I guess I was already by then in my mid-30s, before Mall Cutpurse, which was my first novel, was published. And that was, again, by that stage, I'd kind of left poetry behind. I mean, there's all that poetry you write when you're a teenager, most of which is better left behind in the past. But
so in the day job, were you working on fiction publications, or was it not fiction?
not much. I mean, my first publishing job, I'd been in juvenile publishing, and I was working on children's fiction then. But most of my working life, I mean, when I went down to London from Glasgow, which is where, I'd done some, spent some years in publishing. When we went down to London in 79, I started working for Time Life books. It was the publishing arm of what was then, I mean, it's now Time Warner, it's been through, but it was and its specialty in those days, because it had that tradition of magazine publishing, were books that were these huge illustrated book series, sometimes going to 28, 30 volumes on different subjects, produced in translation, in English and American editions, several foreign language translations, but they were essentially information books of different sorts. I mean, so it was a lot of nonfiction, everything from the sort of the history of folklore, or huge definitive cookery series that was quite an important one in the in the sort of through the 80s, with people like Jane Grigson and Elizabeth David and all sorts of grandees contributing to it. And so it was very much so my particular technical skill, I was either editing or writing. And then when I came back to Scotland, I worked for them and for various other publishers who did that same sort of highly illustrated nonfiction publishing, really until well into the present century.
So was fiction writing a sort of escape from that day job?
It was, but again, I never saw myself as a kind of fiction careerist. I just sort of, I think I was a late starter and perhaps an early finisher in terms of, I essentially published 4 novels and various short stories. But, and I don't know if I have any more prose fiction left in me, but I think somehow as I've gotten older, I really have turned back to poetry is the place where I start.
Right. But I think now you're going to read us an extract from The Dyke and the Dybbuk.
Yeah, I wasn't going to read anything but poetry, except my beloved friend Elaine said, you got to read some of the Dyke and the Dybbuk or I'll be very upset. So this is for Elaine. I'll try not to make it too long, because I know when you're Zoom reading it's different than reading in a bookshop. Okay, the first you have to know, the Dyke in this case is a young woman in London in what would have been the beginning of the 90s, and named Rainbow Rosenbloom, who was a taxi driver, film reviewer for an alternative publication, and had a lot of aunties. Manish Tanaha Laila Hazeh. Why is this night different from all other nights? Because on every other night of the year, Rainbow Rosenbloom may do what she damn well pleases, but on this night she will turn up, out of respect for the memory of her late parents, or simply to get her Aunt Becky off her back. Manishtana Halala Hazeh. Because on this night, the 5 Rosenbloom sisters have marshaled all surviving spouses and any offspring still under their control, and assembled to relive the Exodus. Manishtana Halala Hazeh. Because dinner will not be served tonight until history repeats itself. The Hebrews must be slaves in Egypt. Moses must outconjure Pharaoh's magicians. Jehovah, who is not a moderate, must send down plagues to scare the daylights out of the master race of that moment. The children of Israel must, not for the last time, pack up fast and get out of town. The Red Sea must part, and Rainbow Rosenbloom's people must be let go, just in time to make the copy deadline for the 10 Commandments. Manish Tanahalila Hazeh. Because on this night, as on every Passover, the 4 questions are asked by the youngest male at the table. In this case, the questioner is a 32-year-old dermatologist named Noah, live-in lover of Aunt Becky's adored only son, the Crown Prince Michael. Manish Tanahalila Hazeh. Because on this night, the homophobes sit down with the homos, the Zionists with the anti-Zionists, Labor sits down with Tory, capitalist with community worker, the militantly child-free with a frantically philoprogenitive, vegetarian with carnivore. And the uncles, who would to a man prefer to be in the other room with beer and sandwiches, watching Tottenham Hotspur, are on this night sitting without complaint in jackets, ties, and skullcaps beside their wives.
Thank you. It's lovely. I love all the references there. And you mentioned when we were having a kind of email correspondence, I think, that, or when we were talking, that in this book and in, I think, the next 2 poems you're going to read, you do reference the Jewish festival of Passover, or Pesach as we know it, and the Exodus from Egypt, from the Israelites. And you say it plays a large role in your lost and found version of your Jewish identity.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think partly because, again, going back to the Lowenstein clans, I mean, sometimes we had to go to the Seder's, the other side in New York, where the food wasn't as good, the crack wasn't as good. But, the New Jersey Seder's were just full of a kind of special warmth and excitement. And, from the time we were the little kids crawling under the table, where apparently, according to one of my cousins, I sort of got involved in tying people's shoelaces to the people next to them and things like that. It was just this, it was not phenomenally warm. It was just multi-generational, people sitting at long tables, looking at each other with this kind of just love and excitement. And, it was not a family that was particularly from or particularly pious in that way, but it was so culturally, it was just, this was the moment. I mean, whenever I start thinking, oh gosh, why is everybody making this fuss about breaking lockdown for Christmas? We should all stay well apart from each other. I keep thinking, about the sense of loss we all felt. I think when things were freezing up last Pesach, that sense of, missing the connection. And I guess for me, it's for somehow, no matter how, I'm definitely an Epicurus. I am definitely not conventionally, observant in any way, but the strong connection that always stayed with me was just somehow the Passover, the telling of stories, the telling of a single story, the movement through time and space. And it's only been very recently that I sort of, when I was thinking about poems I might want to read, both for this and for some reading I did with a group of other people at the Jewish Lit a while ago, was how much I've written about Pesach. And that it just, for some reason, it keeps popping up as a sort of icon of where the Jewish identity is, whether or not you are what one of my fellow congregants at Sukkot Shalom would call a God botherer.
A God, say that
a
again?
God botherer.
A God botherer. So, I mean, is it anything to do with the fact that you've also moved away from your home, and so that ties in a bit with the journey out of Egypt? Was that
Well, I don't know. I suppose because when you're sort of connected to people like that, some of whom aren't, they're long gone. I mean, our generation, we're now the kind of the oldies. It's as you kind of take your home and your sense of identity with you. But I did go through a very long period when I felt there was just not a lot for me in the conventional Jewish world. I mean, that if you weren't going to pursue particular paths of, bringing up the kids and the Jewish marriage, that, I mean, I just felt that was, I may have started out making efforts in that direction, but ultimately my life, I realized I was not part of that. And there seemed to be a long period, and I think it was both in the States, but then when I came here, which was in my very early 20s, that just sense I didn't see where the place was for me inside the Jewish world. And I suppose as time has gone on, I've evolved, but then so has the Jewish world. I mean, there is a huge, diverse range of ways to be Jewish now, and but you no longer feel you have to apologize because you're not living in a way that, for those of us in 1950s or early 60s growing up, was just, there were only a couple of, the range of possibility. You could either be Orthodox, or you could be Reform, this is the American thing, or conservative. You had these three sets of options, and there was that sense of, you felt if you didn't march in lockstep, you'd better march outside the door. And I guess it took me a long time. It was really only in, I suppose, the 1980s, I suppose, when I started getting we were living in London, and I found I was getting very fascinated when we go to the supermarket, which was in Stamford Hill. So of course you were seeing, which was a huge area of the Hasidim. I mean, and I began to sort of look at them, and even though on my father's side, we have now realized we come from a long and very distinguished line of rabbis. They were not, I think they were Mitnagdim, they were not Hasidim. But so I felt, but there was still somehow that sense of that tribal connection. And I began to think, I'm still part of this. And I just, at that point, there were beginning to be, there was a lesbian and gay congregation that had started in London. There were women beginning to be rabbis. And in fact, I knew, there's a very important figure in my sort of lesbian activism in London, who then went, having spent a lot of time being a volunteer on Lesbian Line, then became there were two friends who became lesbian rabbis, very out, and real pioneers. And you began to feel there were suddenly conferences, discussions, conversations, and that we had a lot more worlds within the Jewish world than I felt when I was a kid growing up. So I think that made me feel, this is my world too, and my tribe, and I'm still in again. So even though I'm not very theological.
Yeah, so a lot of change, a lot of different things are happening. And I suppose this is an interesting theme, that whatever faith you're from, or if you don't have faith, even just the country or where you grew up, sometimes you drift away from it, and sometimes the further away you get, the more you become attached to it.
Yeah.
I heard someone talking about that recently in a podcast. They now live in upstate New York, but they think about Dundee a lot.
Absolutely.
And perhaps more than when they were young. So, you had success with the Dyke and the Dybbuk, but you said you've now come back to poetry, and I think the next poem that you're going to read also references the Passover. So
Yeah,
do you want
this was
to
one.
talk about that? And
I must say, I had actually really forgotten about this poem. And then when I was trying to sort out some files, try to do one of those good lockdown, let's tidy up moments, that I'd found this poem that I wrote for a wonderful friend of a lot of ours, Stephanie Brickman, who now lives in Copenhagen, but she was a very vital member of not just the whole Edinburgh Jewish community, but was important as a musician and with her Yiddish song project, and was also a great pal of mine in the Yiddish class, which started just around this time. And I had been having a conversation with her about Pesach and said I couldn't, I really missed the Passovers of my childhood, but I didn't feel I could go any, I didn't feel at home going to like a big communal Seder. And she said, come to mine. So I said, well, so what should I bring? Especially because I'm coming from a house full of chametz. And she said, just bring a poem. So this was the poem I brought for Stephanie, and this is years ago. This is about 13 years ago. And the poem is a Pesach poem for Stephanie called The Firkashes. Why is this night different from all other nights? Because on this night, Elijah never comes alone, and you never know who comes with him, or from where or when. Maybe a scrubbed cheder boy from Kovna Gubernia, making the doting auntie skfel with a word-perfect manish tanah. Maybe a sodden soldier from Pharaoh's army, drowned in Drukit, hoping for a towel, and wondering if we mean it when we sacrifice those drops of wine to say there is no such thing as merely collateral damage. Why is this night different from all others? Because the soup was made in a kitchen mobbed with cheerful, gossiping ghosts, and the Bubba's Bubba peers into the pot to find out if her recipe for perfect knedlach has survived all those flights across borders. Why is this night different from all others? Because the table stretches far beyond the room, running through the walls in all directions, across space and time, seating tens of thousands. Why is this night different from all others? Because on this night, we not only tell the story, but become part of the story ourselves.
thank you. So why does Passover play such a big part? I mean, the next poem is about 10 plagues.
Yeah, which strangely enough, even though it is 10 plagues, this was one of the reasons I wanted to read this poem, because I hadn't thought of it particularly. I think maybe it was written around Passover time, but it was written, I belong to a wonderful, very small, very, we think, very one of a kind writing group. With a few other women there, we only, even though the individual composition of the group has changed since it was first set up, we're never more than could sit comfortably around a kitchen table. Don't just do what traditional writing groups, because I have been in others, do, where they might just work among themselves. We have a poet who is a very experienced professional, in the field, as it were, who we have been working with. She sort of mentors and coordinates the group, a poet called Dorothy Baird. And among the things she does, she comes up with the most interesting and challenging just exercises and ways of getting into writing, coming from different directions and playing with different structures. So she'd asked us, one day her proposal was, okay, about the kinds of poems that work in terms of lists. So it must have been around the time of Pesach, because I was thinking of plagues, especially, even before this year, we thought about plagues. But anyway, this is called For 10 Plagues, 10 Remedies. For the plague of pointing fingers, a soft hand raised against them. For the plague of harsh words, a sandstorm of silence. For the plague of self-doubt, 7 chances of sunrise. For the plague of contempt, a cave lined with mirrors. For the plague of indifference, a breeze blowing in from tomorrow. For the plague of deception, the cold light of day. For the plague of suspicion, an uncurtained window. For the plague of rejection, a garden of gifts. For the plague of enslavement, a rain that melts chains. For the plague of forced exile, a safe passage home.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you.
Bless you.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's-
Ellen, Scotland and Edinburgh in particular is very clearly your home. What is it that drew you to Edinburgh and keeps you here? What was the attraction? I'll stop this screen sharing for a minute.
Well, when I first came when I was an undergraduate for a sort of summer course, the sort of thing the university did in those days, money spinners, they would get, you know, foreign students in for summer courses when the university was otherwise quiet in different, and I had applied and gotten a place on one to look at, I think it was 18th century English and Scottish literature. It was British literature, and came, you know, and thanks to a very generous friend of my parents, they were able to afford to send me over. So I was absolutely, I had been to, we had the previous year, the family had had its first ever trip to Europe, which it was just the beginning of the era of cheap charter flights, and the New Jersey Teachers Association organized a cheap flight. So we had come over, and I had just felt in a way that this side of the ocean was where my center of gravity was. It didn't take long, but I hadn't been to Scotland on that trip. This trip, which was 2 years later, it was in '67. I was just knocked out by the sort of the complexity and the richness of the sort of the archaeology, the geology of Edinburgh, the wonderful outright leftiness of Scotland, you know, where socialism was not a dirty word. And the fact that Edinburgh, I mean, I loved Scotland in general, but Edinburgh in particular, because you could look out of it and see the landscape as well as the landscape in the city. You know, you could stand on a hill and you can see over to Fife, and if the light's right and you're standing on Blackford Hill, you can look all the way over and see Ben Lomond. You know, it's the sort of place where however divided urban and rural feel in Scotland, there are things that, filaments that keep weaving it all together. And it just, you know, I guess part of it was a kind of romanticism, part of it was a sort of sense of just I just felt politically, culturally, spiritually more comfortable and connected here. And that was, even to borrow a phrase from my sister-in-law, that I had, you know, come thousands of miles away from a decent bagel. And or so it seemed. We have a really good bagel baker now, but it was just something, it just knocked me out. And I just felt this is the place that I just feel tied to. So I was able, after, you know, after university, then came back and became a postgraduate dropout, had started doing a postgrad degree at Edinburgh University, and then realized I'm getting to the point where the particular Elizabethan writer I am writing a dissertation on was already dead at the age I am now. I'm writing more words about a single aspect of one of his pamphlets, one of his broadsides, then, you know, this is somehow, shouldn't I maybe just be doing other things, writing instead? I just realized I was not going to be an academic. So, and then went back into what I'd been doing in New York, which was I had been working in advertising and then in publishing. So, you know, was able to find a Scottish publishing job. And then when I met my partner, we, in 1979, in fact, just a few weeks after Thatcher's election, we did what in those days you could do. We quit our jobs and went down. I think she got a job first because she worked in a somewhat more specialist kind of, where I knew a publishing, you know, I'd done television work, I'd done this, I'd done that. I knew I'd pick up something in London. There was still that confidence. You could just do that. And so with only one of us having a job, we did what, you know, young Scots do, and we went down to London thinking we'd stay for a year or two, and we stayed, I think, was it for 8 or 9.
And then you came back.
And then came home, you bet.
But this is perhaps a good time to go into your next poem, which I think is
okay. This was actually a birthday card for my partner, but with her kind permission, I will read it. I think I've read it. You know, I think it's been in the newsletter of Sukkot Shalom, so you know, this won't be brand new to everybody. And it's called Mixed Marriage. My half Irish Catholic, half Orange Protestant, entirely atheistical Glaswegian beloved is deeply allergic to strawberries, cinnamon, and all forms of theological doctrine. She never puts her foot into a church, except for weddings, funerals, early music, and her weekly class in Scottish country dancing. My half Irish Catholic, half Orange Protestant, entirely atheistical Glaswegian beloved, would not let a Hail Mary pass her lips, but is word perfect in the Yiddish formulae for deflecting Ein Hara, the evil eye, and knows far better than I do where to find the candles for my parents' yahrzeits. My half Irish Catholic, half Orange Protestant, entirely atheistical Glaswegian beloved is always up for a good domestic spat over the best route to Scottish independence, or whose turn it is to clean the bathroom sink. And then it's Talmudists versus Jesuits, dancing on heads of pins and splitting hairs at 40 paces. And heaven only knows which team will win.
Very nice. A lovely birthday present, I would say. So your Jewish identity and your Scottish identity are important elements in your life. And mixed in is your love of and exploration of the Yiddish language, which we'll come to in a minute. But let's talk about that in a minute. But let's have your next poem, because your next poem, I think, ties together both your Jewish identity, your Scottish identity.
Okay, well, this one, as we say in Scots, is a bit of a mixture maxter, and as we say in Yiddish, it's a bit of a mishmash. It mixes a little bit of each, and it's called One Afternoon in Paradise. It's Yiddish title, not identical, but near Izamola's Geven in Gan Eden. In a chic cafe in the afterlife, where all the high hegians go, two wheel-kent queens sit and reminisce while drinking their Veuve Clicquot, schmoozing and musing together over where their destinies led. Jewish Esther, who saved her people, Scottish Mary, who lost her head. Says Mary to Esther, "Mein teure Schwester, think back on your life and take pride. You've got your own book in the Bible, and you fought off a genocide." "Sigh wie sigh," says Esther to Mary. "Your legend is everywhere known. The jury's still out on your politics, but the choices you made were your own." If they had their lives to live over, each considers what else she would do. Mary vows, "I'd be more feministiga," and cries Esther, "and I'd join me too."
Lovely. I love the way you mix the cultures and the language. And before we talk a bit about Yiddish, let's hear your next poem, which reveals something about Moses.
Okay, fine. This is the God who spoke to Moses on the Mount, for reasons understandable to all, does not do Facebook. But those who know the language of the birds say that Shekhinah, mother of our souls, has flocks of followers on Twitter.
Thank you. So you've had Yiddish all your life, when you were growing up, from when you were a very small child. But over the past, I think, is it 10 years or so, you've been trying to learn more about the language and learn more of the language. And that's not always easy or a simple task, because it's quite, well, there are things to be discussed, I think, in your Yiddish class. Is that right?
Right. Oh, yes. Well, the thing that's important is that Edinburgh is a small but vibrant center of Yiddish learning, because we have a wonderful teacher, Heather Valencia, who is a very distinguished scholar of Yiddish, translator of Yiddish work, and has been for I think it's now, gosh, I think we've been going for way more than 10 years. I think we're, it was definitely in the noughties, it was at about 2006, maybe 2007. I can't remember. Somebody here will remember what the date is. That Heather agreed to start a Yiddish class in Edinburgh. So a small group of us, I think it started out, maybe it was about 20, and then it sort of fined itself down. And over the years, there's some people have come and gone. Heather brilliantly can deal with the fact we are many different levels of ability to learn or what people know. I really had minimal memory of whatever I'd learned as a little kid in Reform Hebrew school of even the Yiddish characters. There are other people who know Hebrew. We have somebody who is a native modern Hebrew speaker, who's also a specialist in his academic specialty was ancient Aramaic languages. So we have, and some people who or native French speakers, native German speakers. It's a great mixture of different linguistic abilities and different levels. And yet we're we've been able to just work constantly on not just the grammar and the speech, but what's most important to us all now, I think, is the access to the literature. And that has been an enormous gift of Heather's, to not only help us learn to read it and, but to give us that sense of what is out there, to connect us to this phenomenal heritage that the, Ashkenazic Jews have, and all Jews have if they want it, of Yiddish literature, which of course was not, it began as a medieval literature that would have been primarily spiritual, primarily religious. Even, books like women who did not learn Hebrew would have the Sena Reino, which was, a kind of a woman's collection of biblical material in a way. But it became, by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, it was a phenomenally vibrant modern European language, full of fabulous inventive poetry, fiction, journalism. And so it isn't just the language of, the sort of nostalgic thing that people who've seen Fiddler on the Roof think it is. It is that. It is it is about folklore and curses, but it is also a very rich resource of cultural resource. And so it's so in part of it, when I first started doing it, it was very much to try to recover what I felt was an inheritance of my grandmother's Yiddish, which was, pretty good, but then it was becoming more fragmentary. It was a remembered Yiddish. It was becoming Yinglish. It was becoming, which people can be scathing about, but it was a mixture of people who come from different parts of Eastern Europe, people who were mixing it in with various other languages they picked up or been ingrained with along the way, and the English from the various parts of New York and New Jersey and wherever they came to. So it's a complicated thing, but it's very much where I feel my inheritance is, where my Jewish identity is. I'm not somebody who's particularly, for all sorts of reasons, emotionally or spiritually connected to Israel. Learning modern Hebrew would not be something I would feel particularly connected to. But Yiddish is in the DNA. And I just, I'm forever struggling to, it's not an easy language. And when I was younger, I was a much better language student. Now I'm old and forgetful, and it's hard to retain a word from the time you look at it in the dictionary to 2 minutes later when you see it again on the next page.
There's different kinds of Yiddish, isn't there? I mean, German Yiddish is different from Polish Yiddish, or different.
There are variations, yeah, where, there are certain things where, like, if you come from where my maternal grandmother's family came from, you won't have a sort of neuter in the way that you might in Klal Yiddish. But then what you also got is it wasn't really codified. There were these different regional things, this mixture about where you were. If you were in Western Europe or something, it was going to be very different than if you were in the Russian Pale. But it was only by my family was in America before scholars sat down and tried to kind of make some rules for a modern literary language.
So your next poem is about Yiddish. Would you like to introduce it, and then let us hear it, and I'll screen share this one.
Okay, this one, I apologies, because I tend to read this. I've written a Yiddish version of it as well. I read it various places, but it's kind of, I like it, so I read it a lot. And it's called Mama Loshen, which in Yiddish, Mama Loshen is the mother tongue.
Sorry, I'm a bit behind on my screen.
That's all right, worry not, just I'll wait.
I'm an amateur at this, folks, sorry.
Listen, I can't do it at all.
I think it's coming now, yes.
Here we are, okay.
Yay.
Right. Mama Loshen wears beads of Baltic amber, a touch of French perfume, and a gun once owned by an Odessa gangster, under a skirt recycled from a sage's prayer shawl. Mama Loshen never leaves her kitchen, yet is never off the city streets, drifting between the study houses and the cabarets, telling jokes that were old when Babylon was young. Mama Loshen has forgotten where she was born and carries 20 different passports sewn into the hem of her raincoat. Mama Loshen sails the seas in a leaky lifeboat, driving off leviathans by reciting her recipes for gefilte fish and pickled herring. Mama Loshen makes time for her lovers, pinching the pale cheeks of Torah scholars, infiltrating their daughters' daydreams, flirting with old socialists on May Day. Mama Loshen knows more songs than the birds, more prayers than the angels, more curses than Cain, and never hesitates to tell hard truths to heaven. Mama Loshen gives me the keys to her house, where 10,000 doors demand to be opened, but she changes the locks between visits if I don't come the moment she calls me. Mama Loshen never stands still, wandering the worlds with her army of poets, leaving me to run stumbling in her wake, desperate not to lose sight of her altogether.
That's lovely, lovely poem. I think time is getting a wee bit short, so can we?
I would say you can biff any of the others.
Oh no, let's go on to the next poem. But
I think there is only one more poem, so I can.
this goes back to your grandmother and grandmother's grandmother.
Okay, and this is kind of explains why my workroom is always in a mess. It's called Curator. My grandmother's grandmothers waving from the dock, from station platform or a market square, watching everyone go out of sight, lost to sea fog, coal smoke, bends in roads. Letters follow, news of births and deaths, scored out by censors or delayed by war. Changes of address that never come, from senders unaware where they'll go next. Yet those who can will finally reunite in tattered photos, whispering in my drawer. Some older than the century gone by, some with names and faces I don't know, but I won't be the one to let them go.
Thank you. The ghosts from the past seem to be very present in your writing, in your imagination. Can you just say something about that?
Well, I think that's what makes me feel most Jewish. The fact that we travel through time as we have traveled through space, that we never collectively, I mean, I'm speaking for the whole family, all of us here, maybe not everybody feels the same way, but I think there is that way we are so connected. We're constantly harking back, also hopefully looking forward, but at the same time, the past, the stories of the past are always with us. I mean, they're just sort of carried with us, or I think memory is so important, and the fact of so much of Jewish ritual, like the fact Passover, back to Pesach, is that retelling of the story, the new interpretations perhaps, but just that sense that if we don't, keeping the past, I mean, in a way, we sort of perhaps invented certain kinds of time. I mean, things like the notion of a week with a Sabbath in it. And this sort of the cyclical nature of some of the holidays, and the telling of the retelling and remembering. I just think it's so much part of, well, it's certainly where I feel connected to it all.
That's lovely. You have a book that is available on Kindle about Yiddish. Would you like to tell everybody about the title?
Well, I think it's kind of an extended essay. I mean, it's minute. It's a totally book, but it's something it was called Yiddish Lost and Found: Eavesdropping on the Ancestors, and it's essentially just a collection of words that I remember. Before I actually started formally learning Yiddish, or as I began to, I made a list of all the Yiddish words that I already knew, and then some of those became the sort of fodder for just taking me on little trips, and wrote little essays, little vignettes of how those words connected to my family and how they used them.
I think it's more than just a collection of words. I mean, the introduction is lovely because it really buys into this thing about the ghosts and eavesdropping on the ancestors, and it's a lovely read, and it's not very expensive.
I wasn't planning this as a book promotion. I mean, I'm terrible at promoting. I mean, but it's been there. It's been on the
it's a lovely read. It's a lovely read, and I think anyone that's interested in language, it's well worth looking at. And I think there's something that's shared with Scottish culture, the Scots language. There are people that obviously write poetry in Scots, but lots of people all over Scotland have Scots, use Scots words, even if they don't know much about the Scots language, and actually I think wherever you come from, there's different languages eat into whatever your native language is, and I think that's quite fascinating. And I love the way you mix Yiddish, Americanisms maybe and Scots in your work. So it's lovely. So now what we thought we'd do, Ellen, if it's okay with you, is open up to questions from our audience, if you're game for that.
If anybody is still here and awake, sure.
I'm sure they are. Adrian, do we have questions?
We have one or two coming in, but I just want to maybe give people the opportunity, if they want to, now's the moment to use the chat facility and send those questions in to me. That would be great. I think there is a question from Joe Goldblatt.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks, Ellen, for a delightful evening. You so exemplify the wonderful diversity and depth and breadth of our Jewish community here in Edinburgh. My question is, how do you think a new Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Center could serve as a catalyst for attracting and cultivating wonderful Jewish talent such as yourself in writing, to help create new writers to carry us forward? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think any at the moment we aren't able to think physically about space. You know, we're thinking this is a virtual space. In a way, right here is a cultural center. But I do think any venue, whether it is virtual or real, that gives people a chance for conversation, for, you know, if there's spaces, whether it's just somebody's kitchen table, whereas our writers group does, or, you know, our Yiddish class, which now meets in somebody's house and used to meet in a seminar room in the old veterinary school, the Dick Vet, and also in the sukkah behind the Orthodox synagogue in Salisbury Road. You know, it's like meeting places are great, gathering places are great, and there's certainly not just a chance to sort of hear writers, but also for things like writing groups or classes. I mean, I think, you know, just places for tables to people to get around, you know, whether it's a Talmud shiur, like the wonderful ones that Mark Solomon provides for us at Sukkot Shalom, or through the iPad at the moment, things like that. I mean, I think connection, places to talk, or places to have what, please God, should be friendly arguments, and, you know, are always, I mean, anything that generates conversation, connection, and also gives people who are new some sort of place to come to is, you know, I mean, so what can be bad?
Jane Jones has asked whether she can ask a question. She hasn't shown us what it is on the chat.
Ellen, and obviously,
Jane.
hello. I love that. It's such a wonderful selection of poetry. And I just wondered, you know, knowing you in our little group, you just seem to me to be like a kind of fountain of words and images and ideas. So I was wondering, is there a kind of ratio between the poems that you just write almost spontaneously, it feels like anyway, and poems that you spend quite a lot of time getting right?
It kind of varies. I mean, you know, sometimes, you know, I mean, you'll know some of these poems because some of them obviously emerged out of our group. There are some, yeah, they just come out and they stay that way, but I do kind of tweak. I mean, things like even Mama Lotion, you know, I mean, there are little tweaks in it, but essentially it started as a splurge and it didn't get heavily edited. I don't just stay with the splurge. Having been an editor for years, I can't keep away from the blue pencil, and there's some that I do put away and come back to, but I don't think, I'm not a great agonizer over, you know, the total poem. I mean, a lot of them pretty much don't change that much from the way they looked when they started out.
We have another question from David Blyman. So David, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please, and go ahead, put your question to Ellen.
You know, this is really an excuse to just enthuse about Ellen's poetry, which really speaks to me. I mean, it's very strange because I'm essentially a South African Jew, and in many ways, my background and that of Ellen are very, very different. But strangely, the relationship to lost Yiddish is very, very similar. And I mean, I found it quite uncanny, the obsession with Passover is something I share as well. So it's very strange. But I will ask a question. Oh, and I just have to say, Mama Roshan. I'm fortunate enough to have heard that one before, and it just sort of says everything about our relationship towards a language that we have perhaps partially lost and is sort of still teasing us. And it's an extraordinary poem. So my question then, I should ask a question. What's the relationship between the number of words that we remember from our heritage and their importance? Because I mean, I have my own view on this, that's sort of inversely proportionate, but I'd be very interested what Ellen has to say about that.
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't know if it's about the number of, I think that it's great if you have a lot of words that you can call on, and you can surprise yourself by, start remembering words and then more come to you. But I think there are probably a few words that are sort of core, in the old rabbinical thing, this do as you would be done to, that's Torah, all else is commentary. I think probably there are, maybe everybody's got their little half dozen words that are the sort of icons that are the keys to some of those doors. But but in terms of whether if you remember a lot or a little, I don't know if that, maybe if you just remember a few, the story is in why those, and so I wouldn't necessarily say, it's a deeper relationship if you only know a few, or if you know a lot more. It's just, it's a question of where those words take you, I guess, or what they bring back to you.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm getting at is I tend to feel that the words which are very few really, Yiddish words, Yiddish phrases, that for them to have stayed with me through the successive generations that weren't really speaking Yiddish, these may have been very important words.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting to think about why those words, why those phrases.
I think you're right. I also think we could, we're not as far apart as you think, because when my grandmother's parents left Lithuania, one of the siblings in that group did go to South Africa. There was a South African branch, so we're probably each other's cousins.
I sometimes think it's also to do with who used these words or phrases, and sometimes there's an attachment to that, whether they're Yiddish words or Scots words or colloquial phrases. It's sometimes the memory of perhaps a relative or a person within your community, and particularly as a writer myself, I sometimes hear the voice of someone, and I eventually get around to thinking, I think that's from my past, where that recurring phrase or word comes from.
Well, certainly my grandmother, Nana, was absolutely it's her Yiddish in a way, more than anybody else's. Other words came in from other places, but essentially hers was a sort of core Yiddish. So I think it was so much having her there, literally sleeping 2 feet away in the other side of the bedroom when I was little. And it's her world that in a way has come down much more than any of the other grandparental lines. But and I think, as I sort of said, I've often, anybody who's listening from in our Yiddish class will say, my grandmother belongs to the Yiddish class. She sits around that table with us all the time, and I'm bringing her up probably to everybody knows Annie.
David, before I hand back to you, perhaps I could just thank Ellen on behalf of EJCC for sharing her sort of rich and absorbing story with us, and more particularly her incredible life-enhancing poetry.
Well, thank you.
I just feel so uplifted having sat here this evening. Even the poems that have got a little bit of melancholy in them, Ellen, I still feel that they are just so uplifting, and heavens, don't we all need that now? Well, so I just wanted to say a personal thank you from all of us to you for that.
Well, again, I'd like to thank Ellen, and I wonder if we could all show our appreciation from Ellen. Maybe go back to gallery view for this, Ellen.
Oh, well, thank you. I go back together.
Um,
Well,
so
thanks to everybody for listening.